Hello and welcome to part 5 of SASS and Compass for web designers. In this part, we are going to build our introduction and our slider. Now, this time we are actually going to use the actual HTML result as a reference. And the first thing we are going to do is we are going to create this little pattern that we have in here. And if you've noticed, the pattern is repeating every now and then. For example, it's in here, and then below the slider, we have the pattern as well. And over here in our newsletter, we have the pattern, and then on the footer as well. So first thing we are going to do is open up Sublime Text, and let's make a pseudo class and call it pattern. So right now, let's add in a background with the pattern. And now if I would save that, it would compile the CSS file and our pattern class would work out just fine. So now I'm going to paste in the pattern inside our images folder. And it's a very simple pattern. If I zoom in, we have only 4 pixels, 2 white pixels, and 2 of them are not so white. So it's a really basic pattern. Now, instead of typing the URL in here, Compass offers a different way to do this. I can type image-URL, and then I can remove this images path from here. And if I save the file now and open up the compiled file, then you can see that Compass automatically compiled the pattern.png to the images folder, and it added in some random numbers for caching. Now, if I open up the config.rb file, then you can see that we have configured our images directory to be images, and that's from where Compass gets this directory in here. Now, if I would change that to something, for example, img, I would actually get an error from Compass because Compass is actually looking at the actual files, and right now I have my folder set to images, so I have to rename this to img as well. And now if I recompile my screen.scss file, then you can see that Compass has run successfully. Now if I open up my screen.css file, then you can see that the folder has now changed to img. Now, if I rename this back to images, save the file and try to recompile this now, then you can see that Compass was unable to compile one or more files for the project, and this time it's complaining about the sprite's location. But as long as we have the correct directory names, this is going to work out just fine. Now, one of the benefits of doing this is that right now the path has been set to absolute. Now, what that means is that if I open up Chrome and try to open this HTML file in here, then you can see I've lost a couple of images in here. All my images are gone, and that's actually because Chrome is looking for images in the wrong location if I open up the file without using a web server. So if you want to work locally and not have a web server, you can easily turn on the relative assets. Now, if you uncomment this and recompile your file, then you can see that Compass automatically changed the path to relative URL. Now what that means is that now if I open up my Chrome again and reload the same file that we had here, now we have our images back. So remember, if you prefer to work on just the HTML file and you don't have any web server involved, then you probably want to turn on the relative assets in the config.rb. And Compass is automatically going to do all the job for you. And when you deploy on the actual server, you can change the HTTP path to something, for example, like tutsplus.com. And now if I save that and recompile the file again, and I actually have to turn off the relative assets now and recompile the file again. Then here you can see that Compass has automatically generated a URL for our image location. So these are some nice little tricks for managing your images. Now, in my case, I want to set everything back. So I'm going to set the HTTP path to / leave my images directory, images, and because I'm working on a local host server, I'm going to turn off the relative assets as well. Now, if I save the file and recompile everything again, then you can see that everything is back to normal. So let's go back to Sublime Text. And we have set our pattern to be the pattern.png and it's repeating. Now we need to style our introduction. So I'm just going to scroll down and we're going to have our introduction above the pitch. So let's call this introduction and start by styling the introduction class. And the first thing we are going to do is we are going to inherit everything from the pattern class. And we're going to do that by typing @extend.pattern. And now when I save that and go to my screen.css file, you can see that the introduction is actually left out empty. But if we search our compiled file for class introduction, then here at the pattern, you can actually see that Compass automatically concatenated the pattern class with the introduction. So now the background URL of images pattern is also applied to class introduction. So let's go back to screen.sass and we can actually do the same thing doing @extend h1. And now if we go back to our screen.css file, wait for the compiler to compile and search for introduction, reload the file, then you can see that h1 and introduction and all the other headings have been set a color, and the h1 and introduction have a font size of 26 set in both of them. And I still don't have an introduction class compiled on its own. If I search the file, there is no class introduction on its own. So only now, when I decided I want to have some padding in here and say the variable of padding, but I want twice as much because this is going to be quite a big element. And now if I save the file and go to my screen.css file as soon as it compiles, now if I search for introduction, there we go, introduction class has been set to padding of 20 pixels. So the extend function in SASS is going to help you extend other CSS selectors. And now we need to make a new variable. And now let's call this one vertical space and set it to be padding times 5. And we can change that later if we feel like it. And now we can set our margin to be vertical space and 0, 0. So now it just affects the top margin. And now if I save the file and open it up in Chrome, so you can see that it slowly starts to look like something we need. A couple of other things here. We need to set the text alignment to be center. Now we don't actually have a variable called mfont, and let's create one right now. Back to the top here, say variable mfont. And M font stands for emphasis font, and we are going to emphasize with Droid Serif. It's a free Google font. If you don't have it, you can easily get it from Google Fonts. And now if I save that, then Compass is actually throwing an error at me, and that's because I have forgotten a semicolon in there. So let me save that again. And if we open that up in Chrome, then you can see that it slowly starts to look like it's supposed to. Now another thing is if we open up the completed version, then right here you can see the border on the top, and we are just going to use a simple border of 1 pixel, and it's just going to be dotted and with the color of C6. And now I'm just adding a couple of properties in here, and if we look at this in our browser now, then you can see that it starts to look similar, and we actually need to get rid of the H1 and just set a font size of 24 pixels. And now if we compare that, then it looks pretty okay to me. Now if we open Chrome back up, here on the right side you can see that the box is actually going over the edge. And now that's because the box is set to be full width, but the padding is set to be padding times 2. And we know from the previous lesson that we can subtract padding in blank work, or the other option is to use border box. Now I'm going to take this full width and just paste it in here and say that I want to subtract. padding, and now times 4 instead of times 2 because times 2 is what we have on one side, and because we have right and left, then we need to multiply that by 2 as well. So in the end, it's padding times 4, and now if we save that and look at it in Chrome, you can see that everything is nice and aligned, and we need to change the border to be set only to the top. And now let's add in the emphasis. All I need to do is set the color to be emphasis color, and we have that variable already in the top, and set the font weight to be bold. Save that and view that in the browser, and there we go. So now we can start styling our slider. Just going to make a new comment in here that we are going to style a slider. And the slider has an ID of slider, so I'm just going to type that in here. And now let's say that this is also going to be full width. And now we can remove this selector in here. And now slider is also going to have the pattern in the bottom. So we are just going to say at extend pattern. And now the ID of slider is also going to be added in the pattern class. We need to set up padding to the bottom. And this time it's going to be just a little line. So it's going to be padding divided by 2. We need to set the positioning to be relative so that the child elements would be relative to the slider div. Now let's open up the HTML file. And here you can see that we have actually two spans. Both of them are called nav control. One of them has a class of left and the other one has a class of right. And they are the previous and next buttons that we are going to have in our slider. So back to Sublime Text, open up the SASS file, and we're just going to talk about the nav control in here. First thing we need to do is we're going to type include hide text. Now what this is going to do, this is another Compass function that is just automatically going to hide any text. If we look at the compiled file, then you can see that it's going to set the text indent to 110% and set the white space to no wrap and overflow to hidden. We also need the buttons to have a position of absolute and make them 45% from the top. It's not 100% precise measurement, but this way we are going to keep it flexible and not spend too much time trying to figure out how many pixels up or down should the nav control go. And now we need to style the hover state, and we're just going to add in the cursor and set it to pointer when the span is hovered. And now we can style the specific buttons, which are the left and the right. So I can type ampersand dot left, and this is going to compile to class nav control dot left. So that basically means an element which has the class of nav control and the class of left. And I'm going to include a sprite. And we haven't looked at these images yet, but we will in a second. Set it to be padding pixels from the left and just copy paste this and do exactly the same thing with the class right. And now if I save that and open up in Chrome, so something went wrong in here, and let's just go back to Sublime Text and quickly figure out what went wrong. Yeah, I forgot to set the display of the span elements, and we need to set that to block, and we also need to set the width to 33 pixels and height to 33 pixels as well. And now if I save that and go back to Chrome, you can see that we have the images, but they are in the wrong place. And that's because I made yet another mistake. I typed padding relative, but we should have had position. So now if I save that, reload the page in Chrome again, now we have our buttons positioned correctly. Now don't worry that at the moment they look completely off because they are set to be 45% from the top, and the height of the div actually stretches down to here and not to the height of the image. But we're going to fix that by styling these dots in here. But before we do, look at what happens when I hover this little arrow right here. You can see that it has a hover effect. And now if you remember, then the only hover effect that we have set is the pointer. Then how come it has another hover effect here? And that actually comes from Compass. Now if I open up Finder, then right here you can see I have named the file arrow left underscore hover, and I have named another file called arrow left. Now if you add in the underscore hover, Compass is automatically going to look for a file named by that convention, and if it's going to find one, then in CSS, Compass is going to write in a hover state for that selector as well. See, right here we have our cursor set to a pointer in a hover, and right here we have the left and the right nav control span elements, and their background positions have been modified. So this is another nice thing that Compass sprites can do for you. So now we can go back to our screen.sass file and start styling the little dots. Now if I open up the HTML file, you can see that the dots is just a simple unordered list, and one of them has a class of active. So let's style the unordered list, which is still inside of the div ID slider. And now we want to position the list, set it to be positioned from the bottom by padding amount of pixels, which in our case we have 10. Set it 0 pixels from the left, and we also need to set a height of 10 pixels, and we're actually going to use a width of function get with 3 columns. Now this function right here is actually a function that comes with blank work, and all it does is it calculates how many pixels is the number of columns I asked for. So in this case, it figures out how wide are 3 columns, and then it returns the pixel value, which is going to be 180 pixels in this case. And now let's style the list items themselves. We're going to float them all to the left. We're going to include a sprite called dot. And if we look it up at our file system, then this is the image that we're going to use there. And we also have a dot empty, which is going to be the active dot. So I'm going to set the width to 10 pixels and the height to 10 pixels as well. And I just happen to know that I also need to add in a padding to the right side of 7 pixels. And now if I save that and go to Chrome, then here you can see that it starts looking somewhat decent. Now, if you pay attention, then we have something weird going on the bottom of our dots, and that's because we need to get rid of the bullets from the list items. And it's also really simple to do. All we need to do in Compass is say at include, and we're going to include no bullets. And now if I save that and go back to Chrome again, then you can see that everything looks fine now. And we also need to style the active list item, and it's going to include the spr.empty. Save that again and go back to Chrome, and there we go. Now let's compare that to our end result, and I'm just going to switch back and forth using command 1 and command 2. You can see that the font size differs just a little bit, but otherwise everything is exactly the same. So let's go quickly back in Sublime Text and fix the font size. All I need to do is set the heading size to start from 24 pixels. And then actually I can remove the font size from the class introduction as well. And now if I compare these two files by switching back and forth with command 1 and command 2, then you can see that everything is almost exactly the same except the font size in our headings. So let's tweak that just a little bit. So we need to change the font size in our nav element to 13 pixels, and now we have almost exactly the same thing. The font size over here is still a little different, but we're just not going to bother with that because it's not such a big deal. So I hope you have enjoyed this lesson, and I'll see you next time where we are going to style the newsletter, the footer, use some CSS3 and advanced SASS functions. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.